The United Nations Biodiversity Conference, known as COP16, wraps 2 weeks of talks aimed at making progress towards protecting nature. We'll look at what was accomplished. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Every 2 years, leaders from around the world gather to discuss the state of life on Earth and work towards preserving biodiversity and halting the degradation of nature. This year in Cali, Colombia, world leaders and government ministers met with experts and civil society to chart the way forward amid global geopolitical and economic challenges. CGTN's Michelle Begay has more in this report.
To survive, humanity must make peace with nature. That was the United Nations chief calling for urgent action and financing at this year's UN Biodiversity Conference held in the Colombian city of Cali.
We must transform our economic models, shifting our production and consumption to nature-positive practices. Renewable energy, sustainable supply chains, and zero-waste policies are not optional. They must become the default option for both governments and businesses.
The UN Secretary General spoke at the 16th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, also known as COP16. The summit is a place where world leaders, environmental activists, and researchers are working together to address biodiversity loss and the restoration of ecosystems. The last summit, COP15, was held in Canada 2 years ago. World leaders signed a pact called the Kunming-Montreal Agreement to set 23 action targets to protect and restore biodiversity. This year, as China passed on the rotating presidency to Colombia, the summit's goal was to accelerate plans of action to meet those goals. One of those ways is by encouraging countries to present their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. At the start of the conference, only 33 out of the 196 countries submitted their updated plans.
But they also become more complex to prepare, comparing to the previous versions. Because now there are clear targets in the framework to which the NBSAPs have to respond to. What you have to understand is that the NBSAPs, as well as the equivalents on the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, they were in the past kind of building upon each other. This, you can't really build much upon the previous ones because you didn't have the targets, right? So it takes more time.
If turnout at the event was any indicator, commitment to build action was strong. According to organizers, more than 23,000 delegates came to Cali, a first for these biodiversity events. 6 presidents and 115 ministers were in attendance for high-level meetings held during the second week of the event. The summit has been dubbed the People's COP. Not only was it a first for the so-called Green Zone, where citizens were encouraged to learn about biodiversity conservation at more than 1,000 cultural events, but participation by indigenous groups and local communities was also high at many of the side events. But indigenous groups and local communities continue to ask for a bigger seat at the table. There was a silent protest in the official Blue Zone, where negotiations were held in the final days. Indigenous groups asked to have a permanent representative body and a work plan under the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has a lot of reference and knowledge, a lot of references on indigenous peoples. Are you not happy with that? That's the question that we receive, right? And we have been telling that having recognition on paper is not enough. We need to put that recognition into actions, right? And one of the immediate actions that parties should do or can do or must do at these COPs is really the establishment of the permanent subsidiary body.
No. Experts like Dr. Susan Lieberman explain that while dialogues in Cali end on November 1st, this only marks the beginning of a new chapter in the fight to stop nature loss and restore the world's biodiversity.
But it's not just you have a meeting and then go home, don't talk to each other, and we'll see you in 2 years. They're intersessional scientific meetings, and we as a science organization, we attend those intersessional science meetings, provide scientific input, and we work with our government partners on the ground. We work in about 60 countries, whether Colombia, Mongolia, or everything in China, and everywhere in between. When we go home from here, we take the decisions and work with our government partners to benefit nature.
Colombia will continue to lead efforts for sustainable biodiversity beyond the summit until 2026, when it will pass the torch to Armenia, the host of the next United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP17. Michelle Vega, CGTN, Cali.
Joining us from Cali, Colombia, is the head of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Grethel Aguilar. Grethel, thanks so much for joining us. There was a joint report that was released by your union as well as the UN Monitoring Center, and it warns that the world must act now to save 30% of the world's biodiversity. Protected, conserved areas need to double on land and triple at sea by 2030. So what is your assessment of where we are right now and what this conference has achieved?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And what I can say is that here there is a positive environment here in Cali. The negotiations are going well, although they haven't finished. On our report, as you know, there is a target for all countries to achieve 30% of conservation of land and ocean. And our report is indicating that for oceans, for example, there is only 8.4% that is being protected, and for land, 17.6%, which means that we need to do much more. In our previous report, we can see that there is some improvement, but we need really to go fast with this, much faster than what the countries are really achieving. Although there are also good news, 51 countries already achieved the target of 30 by 30, and this is a good news. But of course, I think that all governments, civil society, private sector, we all need to join forces so that we can achieve the protection of our planet. As for how the discussions are going here, I believe that there has been some achievements. For example, 2 days ago, there was the approval of the Work Plan for Indigenous Peoples, Article AJ, which was really well received. Many people were in the room, many indigenous peoples were in the room, which is very, very, very good. It was a really a key moment. So that was really good. Also, there was this agreement on doing the linkages between the Convention on Biodiversity and BBNJ for the ocean. So I think that there has been some progress today. The negotiations need to take us to good results in terms of the financial mechanisms, in terms of how we are going to have an equitable chain of benefits from biodiversity. And of course, there is also a pending issue on a subsidiary body for indigenous peoples. But I think that there has been some progress, and we hope for good results.
You mentioned financial mechanisms, and that is the big question, isn't it? COP15 in 2022 set a target of $700 billion, beginning with $200 billion a year by 2030, but much of those funds have not materialized. So how big a challenge is funding?
Yeah, there is, of course, there is a gap on financiation, and I think that all the countries know this. There is a need for more dialogue, but what is really needed is to put the resources on the table so that we, as a planet, and not just as countries or individuals, can achieve this goal of protecting our planet for the well-being of people. So what we hope is that the countries that can do it can bring the resources to the table, the ones who need the resources to do the work well, and for all of us to have a strong mechanism for monitoring of good results. I think that this is the time because we are in a crisis, and everybody knows that there is this triple planetary crisis of climate change, of loss of biodiversity, and pollution. So we don't have time to wait for long negotiations. We really need to take action on the ground and work with the people. And for that, we need the resources. And this is not a matter of if we can or if we're gonna have an agreement. This is an emergency. This is an emergency. And the emergency is not just for one country or for the other, it's for the planet. I think that all citizens around the world, we have been seeing everything that is happening from fires, from floodings, from people leaving the countries because they don't have conditions to do agriculture on healthy soils. I mean, there are a lot of things happening, and I think that those things are in front of our eyes.
Right now, forests are home to most plant and animal species. That's in any ecosystem. In 2021, more than 100 countries pledged to halt deforestation. And your union says that 38% of the world's tree species are in danger of extinction. At what point will that become irreversible? I mean, how far down the road have we gone?
Well, indeed, there is a lot of concern in relation to how many species of trees we are losing. Our assessment is telling, as you just said, that around a quarter of the species of trees that we assess are at the risk of extinction, and this is very serious for all of us. I think that, if we lose our biodiversity, at the end, the planet will not be able to sustain our life, on Earth. And this is key. Now, I also want to say that there are positive news. There are many around the world that are trying to keep our forests, that are doing good intents to protect our lands. For example, let me say that indigenous peoples are at the front line of defending our natural resources and our forests because they depend on them. But we all depend on the forest. We need the forest to have clean air. We need the forest to have spaces for our mental health. We need the forest for our own survival. And what is happening now is that we are not paying enough attention. And we keep losing our biodiversity. We keep losing our species of trees. And this needs to stop. This needs to stop. We can continue to produce more reports, but we are really hoping that the next reports can give us good news, because we are discussing here how to save natural resources, how to have a planet where we can all prosper. But if we continue with this rate of deploying, not deploying actually solutions that we need, then this is a real issue. I believe, on the other hand, that we have enough science, enough tools, and there is willingness. So what do we need really to put things into function? What we need actually is political willingness. We need to unite. We need to bring everybody on board. This is not just the job of one or two sectors. Everybody needs to be involved: the agriculture sector, the financial sector, the health sector, of course, the ministries of natural resources, that they are already involved. But this needs to be seen as a cross-sectoral effort. It needs to be, nature needs to be at the center of decision-making in the countries. It cannot be in one box. It cannot be only in one ministry, because it's across everything that we do.
Right, you mentioned the role of indigenous people, and there is one effort that's underway right now. It's a major effort. It's getting a lot of attention. Indigenous people have been called upon to be the guardians of nature. At COP16, indigenous leaders from 9 Amazonian countries, that's the G9 as it's known, pledged to defend the region's biodiversity. I mean, how important is this effort by indigenous leaders?
It's not just important, it's crucial. And I think that this is not new. Indigenous peoples have been protecting our lands, their lands, for ages. And I think that the effort they're bringing to the table is something that we should all support, because while there have been, in their territories for centuries, we have not been paying attention to all the efforts they're doing. Many of them are dying because they want to protect their territories and their lands. We call them environmental defenders. And for example, where we are now in Latin America, many are dying because they want to defend their territories, and many have very difficult fights just because they want to protect the natural resources that they depend on and that we all around the world depend on. So I guess that indigenous peoples are doing a big effort on behalf of all of us. And sometimes people don't notice that. So the effort of the Amazon people, the effort of many indigenous peoples around the world is just something that we all need to praise, that we all need to be thankful, and at the same time, we need to support them, because this cannot continue being done just by indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples also need resources, financial resources. Indigenous peoples cannot do it alone. The pressure is immense. So I of course congratulate the peoples of the Amazon, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, for this initiative. But we need to support them. We need to join forces together with indigenous peoples. And most of all, we need to learn from their traditional knowledge and wisdom and respect them and make sure that the claims are heard and that we respect their lands and territories.
Grethel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, there's much more to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Changhua Wu chairs the Asia Pacific Water Forum's Governing Council. Andrew Miller is the Advocacy Director for Amazon Watch. And Lynn Lee is the Senior Director for Global Policy and Advocacy at the World Wildlife Fund International. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Lynn Lee, let me start with you. This is an important conference taking place in Colombia. It follows the Montreal conference, and this is the time for reflection and to take stock of what's taken place so far, what needs to be done. Now, going into COP16, the World Wildlife Fund had 5 key expectations. What were they and were they met?
Thank you for having me here. WWF, we came here with 5 expectations that are critical to deliver the agreement we made in 2022, which is called the Global Biodiversity Framework. We come here, we want a country to take actions through the national plan for the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan and BSAPs, and to revise them, to deliver them, and really to start implementation. We came here also to look at the resource mobilization to really deliver what the world has agreed on. We came here expect that implementation should be inclusive and human rights-based, comprehensive implementation through a whole of government, whole of society approach. We came here to look at synergies to address the interlinked crises like climate change, like the nature loss. We came here to also look into a funding mechanism, the multilateral funding mechanism, that can really ensure that the genetic resources that have been benefiting people being paid back to the people who are providing and as a guardian of them. So that's the 5 expectations we came.
Right.
Being here 2 weeks with a lot of sleepless nights, we see the mixed progress. Some forward, some still being discussed.
Andrew Miller, what are your key takeaways from COP16? Where do you see progress, and where do you see, where a lot more work has to be done?
Well, first, thanks for hosting this important discussion. I just got back from a little over a week there, accompanying different local processes from the Amazon rainforest, mostly indigenous peoples, as they worked hard to try to bring their issues forward. There was a lot of participation. I think Colombia really should be congratulated for opening up the space for local communities. Many people came. At the same time, really getting into the conversations, into the negotiations is a huge challenge. Obviously, these are very technical issues, and of course, dominated by the states. it's also worth mentioning that those aren't the only actors that are there, and some of the actors that are directly implicated in destruction of biodiversity, like the oil industry, are also on hand. So that creates a bit of a challenge, I think, for communities. You know, a lot of the voices were raised, different proposals were brought forward. You know, how much they're included in the discussions and brought on by governments remains to be seen. They're definitely very important initiatives to try to you know, raise the profile of the role that oil companies are having. And unfortunately, a lot of that gets sort of zeroed out by governments within the language. And so, you know, this, of course, is just one process, one step. A lot of people are looking forward to the COP30 climate summit also. So hopefully between now and then, the focus on the Amazon rainforest and the importance of protecting it will continue.
Right. On the Amazon rainforest, Andrew, under the current situation, about 40% of the Amazon rainforest is not protected right now. And of course, what is even more alarming is that right now we're seeing forest fires in the Amazon. Is that sort of indicative of, you know, of a global ecosystem which is fast approaching the point where things could be irreversible?
Absolutely, and there's been a coalition of groups from the Amazon and around the world that are talking about the need to protect 80% of the Amazon, and not just by 2030, but by 2025. So that really requires governments to, of course, stop deforestation, to stop the expansion of extractive industries like oil and mining into the Amazon, but also to title indigenous territories, and really to provide resources directly to indigenous peoples and other local communities so they can carry out different kinds of livelihood activities. They're not dependent on extractive industries. Another massive issue in the Amazon are illegal economies, narco trafficking, illegal gold mining. So these are all major threats. And yes, unfortunately, the Amazon very well is reaching the tipping point. We don't know when that happens, but the fires and the historic drought that are happening right now really could be indicators of that tipping point. So the need to support local communities has never been stronger. Yeah,
Changhua, well, good to see you. 2 years ago, there was the landmark Kunming-Montreal Global Diversity Framework Agreement, and they came up with 23 targets to halt and also to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. I mean, 2030, that's just a little over 5 years away. What tangible progress have you seen, especially in developing countries?
Well, many developing countries have already started to take the actions in terms of really putting together their own national biodiversity strategy and action plans. Of course, if you look at the numbers, the timelines reflected in the Cali COP16, there's a sharp shortfalls in terms of the number of countries really submitting that. But definitely China and many other developing countries are definitely taking the actions there. They need support in many ways, probably, including technical support. This is not something you just write on paper, say, I write a plan, then that's it. Rather, it has to be sort of deployed at the national level and aligned with the global Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or with all those targets there. Technically, it's very challenging, and the financing is also falling really, really short. And very importantly, we need to address at the globally, you know, through the COP process about the funding mechanism, about equity issues, about, you know, monitoring accountability issues. But in the meantime, at the domestic level, I think countries, not only themselves, but maybe among more developing countries, they should come together, support each other, and learning from each other so that they will be able to accelerate the process in order to deliver the goals set in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the target by 2030.
Lynn Lee, we've just got a few minutes left, but I want to talk about the challenge that I addressed earlier on with our guest, and that is the challenge of funding. You've said previously that trust building is still required on the issue of finance. I mean, how do you see this being met as the process moves forward?
The negotiation is quite heated, even at this moment is ongoing. The technical negotiations really heated the debate on the funding, how the funding is built and what shapes it's going to take. At this moment, when the ministers here, they are taking the political decision. Then there's also funding talk about using the genetic resources and how the multilateral global funds should work. So those two issues are really combined. They become the very sticky issue that are holding hostage of many other progress that are going on. It's quite steep, deeply debated now. It's hard to predict the results actually at this moment. And in the next few, maybe less than 10 hours, we will see some results.
Andrew, how important is the direct participation of those groups that have formed themselves into the Amazon G9?
Well, indigenous peoples have a bunch of rights that are very important to respect, including the right really to self-determine and to be involved directly in policies that affect them. And certainly at this level, these conversations, it's really important to have those voices to really determine how and when the different sort of solutions that are being discussed will be implemented. I think on the funding question, there is a great recognition of the need to get money into the hands of communities, but they also need to have a say in how that money is used, but where it comes from, the terms of those negotiations. For example, I think communities are very concerned about the possibility that funding for biodiversity or for climate change are coming from the same actors that are actually catalyzing the climate change. So, are there some sort of based credits, biodiversity credits or carbon credits in our oil companies, for example, the ones purchasing those and able to continue their operations, and to essentially greenwash their image. So I think where the money comes from is almost as important as where it goes and how it's used.
Okay, Changhua, we've only got a little less than a minute here, but China's taken the lead on climate change. It was one of the co-leaders at the Paris meeting, and then it's also taken the lead on bringing down the levels of pollution. What is China doing right now in preserving biodiversity and trying to build a healthier environment?
Well, China has already submitted its national biodiversity strategy and a national plan, aligning really with the global targets and really deploying, integrated those targets into domestic action. Besides, we're talking about the funding. So the Kunming Biodiversity Fund, already China put together $211 million as the leadership indication to lead the process and already get the ball rolling. Of course, the current negotiation, people seem to be stuck in that space. Hopefully somehow they'll be able to open up their mind and really put cooperation, collaboration first and working together to address the challenge.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.